Today I'm going to talk to you about the oval chainrings from AbsoluteBLACK. I've been using the chainrings for several months now, which has given me enough time to really have a play about and experiment and switch between ovals and circulars a couple of times just to get used to the feeling and the sensations and bring this little review to you. I should caveat it with the fact that this is by no means a scientific experiment. This is literally just a debrief on my findings and my experiences of using the chainrings. First though, why did I start using the chainrings? Well, I was getting a little bit of an issue with a sort of niggling injury on my right hip, and after some consultation with Nuno at the Orbis Lab, he suggested I try the chainrings. As I felt it, the injury was as a result of maybe pulling too hard on my right leg and pushing too hard on the left, and what I was seeing in my power data was that my left leg power data was sort of 3 to 5% higher than the right leg measured on the Durace dual-sided power meter. And so one of the suggestions Nuno had was with the oval chainrings to help try and alleviate some of the sort of resistance or the pressure on the hip flexors, especially at the top of the pedal stroke when you're in that sort of constricted position. So let's explain the theory as I understand it anyway. Throughout the pedal cycle, we utilise different muscle groups at different points. We use the naturally bigger muscles like the quads, the hamstrings and the glutes during the push phase of the pedal cycle, and then as the pedals come back up towards the back, we use a bit more of the rect fem, the antib and some of the hip flexors. And so these muscles are naturally a little bit smaller, and so they're under more load. And with a circular chainring, the load is evenly distributed throughout the pedal cycle. So these muscles are contributing as much on the up as the other muscles would be on the down. With an oval chainring, however, the diameter across the chainring is changing throughout the different cycles. So if I sit here in the downward phase of the pedal cycle, where we've got our naturally bigger muscles at work, we're producing force across the larger diameter of the chainring, which means it's the equivalent of having like our 53 or whatever. And so we're getting more force or more output. As the pedals come round and we get to this sort of the dead spot or the weaker point of the pedal cycle here, where we're now having to rely on the naturally smaller muscles to contribute, we're now pulling against the shorter diameter, and then this is almost like the equivalent of having a compact chain set on. So it means that is easier for these naturally smaller muscles to deal with. And then obviously as the pedals come back up over the top, you can see we change back across this longer part, and then on the other side we've got the downward force being applied. So how does this feel in practice? Well, what I noticed is that during the push phase of the pedal cycle, I felt like I had to push for longer. I felt like I needed to push harder at that point, especially at the bottom of the pedal cycle. I felt like I had to push harder for longer, and I felt the sensation more in those driving muscles. As you reach the sort of dead spot and you're coming back on the upward cycle, I think the sort of feeling of resistance disappeared a lot. So you felt like you got a bit of momentum for nothing, and you carry on through that phase of the pedal cycle. Now, although this felt initially when I jumped on and tried these, it felt very different. I wouldn't say it necessarily feels wrong. And within a few minutes of the first test ride, already I could feel myself sort of fitting into that cycle, and it felt very comfortable, very normal. Interestingly, when I changed back to the circular chainrings, it was all of a sudden I was very aware that I was now pushing, and I could feel the sort of sawtooth, very up and down motion with my legs rather than a circular motion, and that the sort of increased load on the upward phase and that sort of feeling of your feet lifting in your shoes as you sort of pull up over this bit was far more. I was far more aware of that feeling in the circulars than I was in the ovals. Now, after about 6 weeks of testing with the AbsoluteBLACK chainrings, the couple of interesting things to note for me personally. One was that my power distribution evened out to sort of within about 1%, and interestingly enough, my right leg now was reading the percent higher on most cases. I think probably an indicator that I was accessing those push muscles like the glutes and the quads more, and certainly giving my hip flexor a bit more of a rest, and subsequently that niggling pain in my hip reduced and actually pretty much resolved itself. Now, when I jumped back onto the circulars to sort of test the difference again, interestingly enough, that issue in the hip became an issue again. So it's definitely a sign that for me, I'm using the, maybe on the circular, I'm pulling up too much using the hip flexors on this right side, whereas when I'm on the ovals, I'm focusing far more on the push phase of the pedal cycle, and that's definitely balancing me out left to right a lot better. You know, overall, in terms of overall power output, nothing really seemed to change much. I would say I'm probably producing a little bit more power in general when I'm using the ovals, and I think that is just because it's like it triggers you to be more focused on the push phase, and I think that then allows you to access these bigger muscle groups a bit better. I've always been a skeptic of oval chain rings. I guess my biggest concern was always that any good that could be done by having an oval chain ring was always going to be undone the first time you dropped a chain in a race. And to begin with, I had a little bit of trouble. I found it quite difficult to get the front mech set up correctly, and in particular what I was having an issue with was getting the front mech close enough to the chainring without the trailing edge making contact with the teeth as it comes into the widest point of the chainring. I did persist though, and eventually I managed to get it in the sweet spot, got it nice and close. I do believe that there's some little tapered wedges you can use which alter the angle of the front mech as well, which I think might help. But like I say, I did manage to get it into the sweet spot, and since then it's performed really well. There's some sort of well-engineered contours on the back of the chainring which help to lift the chain without too much chain slap. I mean, obviously you can make the chain slap and rattle around, but you can do that on a circular chainring too. I've tested this, sort of rigorously because to be honest, I kind of wanted it to fail so that I could say I told you so to Nuno. But actually it's been good. It's been tested on under strain, changing gear on climbs and using it on the turbo and whatnot, and it's performed really well actually, so I can't complain on that front. I would say, however, though, I think the tolerances for the setup on the front mech need to be tighter than on a normal circular chainring, and you've just got to persist and really get it right. Okay, quick conclusion then. I think overall there's a place for the oval chainrings in everybody's cycling armoury. For me personally, it's helped me to develop those bigger muscle groups in the push phase of the pedal cycle, and it's allowed me to be more balanced and help me sort of regulate my left-right balance through the power meter, and in turn reduce my injuries really. So hopefully you found this review thorough enough and interesting. If you've got any more questions or you want to get your hands on a set of the Absolute Black oval chain rings, I would definitely recommend getting in touch with Nuno Gama at the Orbis Lab. Cheers!